We are fortunate enough to have Dr. Abby Page here with us to give a talk from across the pond. So it's a little late where she is right now, and we appreciate that she's doing this live with us right now. Dr. Page did her undergraduate at the University of Durham, and she did a master's and PhD both at the University College of London in medical anthropology and biological anthropology. Since then, she spent a postdoc and then a lecture quantitative skills fellow at UCL and also the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. Is one of the leaders of the Hunter-Gatherer Resilience Project. Dr. Page will be talking about her research called Beyond the Mother Evolutionary Perspectives on Cooperative Childrearing. Her research is really focused on understanding the relationship between the environment, so both the social and physical and behavior, and ultimately how this influences human health and well-being. And with that, I will shut up and let Dr. Page take it away.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you everyone for coming to listen to my talk today. So yeah, broadly speaking, I'm an anthropologist by training who now resides in a public health and demography department. And so I'm working in an interdisciplinary setting to bring together some different strands of research on social support and maternal and child health. And I just kind of want to bring those together for you here today. So in my talk today, I want to make the point that we always make assumptions about who are important supporters or caregivers of mothers with or women with young children. And these assumptions are frequently dependent on our disciplinary backgrounds. This can mean that we are overlooking some important dimensions to social support and childcare, which may reduce our ability to improve the situation. So I hope to make this point by reviewing some of my research, firstly on cooperative childcare among mothers from a population of hunter-gatherers in the Philippines called the Agta, which I worked on during my PhD. And then secondly, I'm going to hop all the way across back to the UK context to look at mothers who are feeding young infants. So these are two really diverse settings, but I think through them, I hope that I can demonstrate that mothers are supported by a wide range of individuals, and they are supported in different ways, and these have potentially very different consequences. So basically, I want to explore the complexities of this support. By the end of my talk, I hope that I've indicated that support is complex and there is no one-size-fits-all solution. But if we pay attention to the mechanisms by which this works, I think we're really able to increase our understanding about how women with children can be best supported. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview about social support and allo mothering from the public health literature as well as anthropology. Social support is being situated within social networks which offer perceived or actual help in the form of emotional, practical, or informational support. So emotional support is the support which encourages individuals. It can make you feel more confident, it can increase your self-efficacy and make you more effective. Practical support is a direct action to help someone. That's also known as instrumental support. So this could be something like resource provisioning, childcare, or domestic tasks. And finally, informational support is providing knowledge or guidance or advice to help an individual, such as advice about how to breastfeed. During this talk, I think I'll be using the umbrella term of social support because it encompasses a broad way that individuals can help women with children. And I use this term in particular because I think it's more widely understood outside of cooperative breeding literature, which is prevalent in behavioural ecology and anthropology. But also the cooperative breeding literature has tended just to focus on practical forms of support and want to broaden this out to also think about emotional and informational support. So I'm also going to talk about the context of social support in particular in the context of infant feeding, because it's a particularly vulnerable period which requires a lot of support, and this acts as a nice case study. And some of my research I'll be presenting on later will be on infant feeding, so hopefully we'll tie together. So in the UK context, breastfeeding rates are really low, and some people and it's often experienced to be very hard and painful, and it is a learnt behaviour, and which mothers and infants both need to learn skills. One of the issues of breastfeeding is one of the reasons why women may stop earlier than they intended to, and some have proposed this because they don't have the support they need to work through these issues. And so one argument is that informational support would be really important because there is a weakened culture of breastfeeding in the UK because there's now been 1 and 2 generations which haven't had a lot of breastfeeding experience. So mothers are unable to draw on support from their family and friends. Therefore, in response to these findings, public health services and interventions have focused on providing advice and information to mothers from primarily healthcare professionals about breastfeeding. In particular, they focus on the positive effects of breastfeeding and perhaps some techniques or methods about how to breastfeed and solve common problems. While mothers often do request information about how to breastfeed, as I said, it is a learned behaviour, the majority of randomised control trials in the UK context have been quite ineffective at increasing breastfeeding, or if they do, it's quite limited to the first couple of weeks. And one of the reasons this is that social support is treated in a very uniform fashion. And while it's recognised that, as I talked about, there are different types of support, which will have theoretically different outcomes for the mother, these studies rarely define or clarify what they mean by support or the mechanisms in particular by this, how the support will be impacting mothers and children. Rather, the support is assumed to be supportive in a way, in this context, it's going to increase breastfeeding duration. And I think this is a questionable assumption, which I'll demonstrate a bit later. Another reason for the lack of effectiveness is there's quite a narrow focus on the pool of supporters, primarily fathers and healthcare professionals. And it's designed around individual behavioural change, meaning they're targeting the mother as the primary caregiver while ignoring the wider social networks. And this bias within the public health approach is primarily due, I think, to Western norms around the nuclear family. So the nuclear family has been the centre of social policy in defining the relationship and responsibilities. Social sciences, in particular demography, sociology and economics, have made the assumption that the nuclear family has been the traditional norm. For instance, the demographic literature has viewed the increased female participation in the labour force in the post-World War II period as a decline of the family, with concerns that the mothers are abandoning their children for work, decreasing marriage and fertility rates as a result. But interestingly, subsequent demographers have been perplexed when they haven't seen the catastrophic consequences for child well-being that were predicted. And the social sciences, due to a lack of diversity and a cross-disciplinary dialogue, have too often drawn the conclusions about what is traditional and natural based on their own family environments in that kind of post-war period from what they grew up in. Furthermore, Western perspectives also tend to focus on adult caregivers. They think about expert maternal focused care, overlooking, for instance, older siblings in the household. And these informal types of childcare, often who do come from children, are seen as substandard because they don't fit into Western understandings of higher quality, intensive childcare, focused around attachment care, childcare, for instance, which are provided by mothers and or trained experts. So I argue that these assumptions are stemming from Western white and middle class norms impact how we view social support, and it has very implications about understanding how women manage and then how we are best able to support them. So I wanted to flip this and then look at how the anthropological and evolutionary literature has approached the situation. So if we look at humans and a cross-species perspective, we see that our life history schedules do differ a lot from other great apes. And the life history schedules are things like the timing of key events in an individual's life course, such as age at weaning, age at first birth, age at last birth, as well as interbirth intervals, or the timings between kids. So on this figure here, from a review paper by Kramer in 2010, we have the different great apes on the y-axis and then age on the x-axis. And each of these bars is broken up into these key life history periods. The L stands for lactation, C for childhood, which is unique to humans at the bottom there. The J is for the juvenile period, and that's all the time in which someone is not yet fecund. And then after the age of 15, in the human case, we have this fecund period, and then the arrow starts when you have the age of first birth and all the way into the age of last birth. And what we can see from this really nice graph is that there are quite a lot of differences between humans and the other great apes. In particular, we have a very short lactation period. So our age at weaning is much earlier, around 2 to 3 years on average. And this means that our interbirth intervals are about half that of the great ape species. But in combination of that, we also have these really long dependency periods. So there is a long time that our children are dependent on their parents, and we have a later age at first birth. And as a result, we have this combination of that we have a much higher total fertility rate, or completed family size, which from natural fertility populations averages to about 6 to 8 children, which is double that of the other great apes. And so human mothers are managing to produce multiple dependents of different ages with different developmental needs, which is referred to as the stacking of children. And we do that despite the fact that they require a lot of investment, and they require a lot of investment over a long time period. And this has been argued to be possible due to the fact that children they're not getting any investment at all. It's just the mothers withdrawing investment, because allo mothers, who are individuals, anyone other than the mother who provide, any individual other than the mother who provides some form of childcare or investment in children, so this also includes the father. Researchers like Sarah Hurdy and Karen Kramer have argued that we're able to stack our offspring so well and combine the rapid production of children alongside their increased survivalship, thanks to the evolution of cooperative breeding or cooperative childrearing. The focus, as I said before, in anthropology has primarily been on practical support, but we also equally emotional and informational support are likely highly important because of the vulnerability of mothers in the early postnatal period and the higher demands of a newborn. The presence of allo mothers and the adaptive benefits of kin presence have been recorded in temporal and spatial cross-sections of the world's population. And these primarily are larger scale, more demographic studies looking at kin absence or presence as a proxy for support, and seeing how this is correlated with child survivorship. So this figure is from Rebecca Sear and David Cole's work, and based on an extension of the previous one with Ruth Mace, and looking at how a wide range of kin are positively associated with kin survivorship, which is the purple bars in the plot. In general, obviously, mothers are really important for child survivorship, as are siblings and maternal grandmothers, which are the MGMs in the plot. However, there is significant variation in the cases where there are some kin types have no association with survivorship, which are the yellow bars, and some are negatively correlated with survivorship, which are the more reddish bars. The majority of studies demonstrate that one relative is positively correlated with child survivorship, but who that individual is seems to be context dependent. And while these studies have much bigger sample sizes and they have long-term data, we don't really know about the pathways which are linking up presence, support, and child and maternal outcomes. So it's a bit of a black box. Furthermore, the studies have tended to focus on kin, in particular grandmothers, fathers, and siblings. And this is much because a lot of the evolutionary work has worked within the paradigm of kin selection. Also because there's been quite an interest in understanding the evolution of key events or social groupings, such as the post-reproductive lifespan, pair bonding, or the uniquely prolonged childhood in humans. However, just as a side effect between these focuses is that support from distant kin and non-kin, friends, and informal settings has gone comparatively underexplored. However, individuals frequently live and interact with a high number of non-kin, so they are likely important if understudied. So that a bit of a whiz of the literature, just to summarize, that mothers do not raise children by themselves, and studies have tended to focus on nuclear and the extended family, but we also expect distant kin and non-kin to be important. Support is often assumed to be unidimensional and to improve maternal and child outcomes, but we don't know much about the pathways linking support to maternal and child outcomes. So I hope I'm going to present some research which I hope starts to address a couple of these questions that I've raised. And in particular, my work with the Agta is going to be looking at how a whole range of supporters have helped mothers, but who helps her has consequences for the consequences of the mother has some kind of impact is dependent on the who's providing the support. And then my work in the UK context will explore the entirety of the mother's social networks as well, but focus on the type of support received and demonstrate that how experiences with infant feedings and the type of support will have an impact on maternal outcomes. So I'll just give you an introduction to my work with the Agta. So there's about 1,000 Agta living in Palanan, Isabela province, located in the northeast of Luzon in the Philippines. And we worked with about 900 of them over a 2-year period in 2013 and 2014 now. So this was during my PhD. We collected lots of data, including a demographic census, reproductive histories, activity and time budgets, as well as childcare observations, which are the focus of the presentation today. And the Agta live in a relatively isolated area of the Philippines, so it's not easily reached just because of some geographic features, but they do live with and communicate a lot with nearby non-Agtas. They are primarily fisher foragers, and that's because they either live on the coast or inland river basins. And while we're there, only about 3% of their activities were hunting. But there is a lot of variety in the population, with some individuals spending more time in wage labour, for instance, or cultivation. With my co-author pictured here, we conducted focal follows on 78 children aged between 0 to 6 years. And we did this over a period of 10 months. We managed to watch most of the children in the camps that we visited. And to do focal follows, you choose one kid and you follow them around for 3 hours, and then you do that over 3 non-consecutive days for a total of 9 hours. You make a record of who that child comes in contact with, and if they're over the age of 6, they're defined to be an allo mother. And then you record if there's any low investment activity, and that's proximity watching. So it might not take any resources at that point in time, but you are able to intervene if you need. Then the other type is high investment childcare, and so that's playing, feeding, cleaning, holding, helping, anything like that, which takes considerably more effort. And so you make a record of that every 30 seconds. If you can see in that picture, I have some headphones, and it just gives me a beep every 30 seconds when I make a record. Yes, I did hear that beep in my dreams for a while afterwards. So in total, for each child, we had about 1,080 data points, and the children interacted with 3 to 4 people per observation. That created a total of 1,500 dyadic interactions, or about 200,000 observations. And just in the analysis, I won't go into much detail later on, but just to say we use mixed effect models clustered at the childhood, allo mother, household and camp levels to account for all the pseudo replication in the data. Okay, so just be now talking about the results in terms about who provides the childcare in the Agta. And as I said, I'm focusing here on all the directs or the practical support in terms of childcare. And we do have data in terms of food provisioning and domestic tasks, just haven't been able to analyze it yet. So hopefully more to come in those areas. So this graph is from a forthcoming publication in a special issue of Field Trans B, which I'll be talking about a bit later. And it's the first publication of all this childcare data. And this demonstrates who is providing both low investment and high investment care. And with the mother is included there on the x-axis. And then we have father, brother, sister, maternal grandmother, paternal grandmother, maternal grandfather, paternal grandfather, extended kin, distant kin, and non-kin. And then we have the proportion of all the children's interactions on the y-axis. This is separated into infants in the blue and toddlers in grey. And broadly speaking, that infants are the one being breastfed. So it's just 0 to 2 years, and toddlers are 2 to 5.9 years. A couple of interesting features is obviously the mothers are doing the majority of the care, especially for the younger children, about 25–26%, but that does drop down as the child gets older. And the first thing to note is that it's an interesting U-shaped distribution in the fact that the non-kin are actually also in toddlers offering about 25% of interactions. And of course, it's not directly comparable because you have many non-kin in the population compared to only one mother. So the cost of each individual is less. But from the child's point of view, they are receiving a lot of their care from individuals who aren't related to them. Next important thing to note is that sisters are quite important allo mothers in this population, about 5% of care for infants and 20% for toddlers. Brothers aren't too far behind, with similar levels to fathers at 5% and 10%. Finally, what's really interesting here is the very small amount of childcare which is coming from the grandparents. It's lowest for the paternal grandmother and paternal grandfather, and at the most it's about 3% for the maternal grandmother in toddlers. So I think it's really interesting, particularly because grandmother's been hypothesized to be so important, about why they're offering very little care in this context. So to look into this in more detail, I wanted to look at the demographics of the camps and the structure of who was present in the camp. So first of all, this plot is just a representation from the child's point of view about what kin were alive for the different for each child. So remember, there's 78 children, so basically all the children had their mother and father alive. And we can see about 50% of children had grandparents, with paternal grandmothers being the least likely to survive. It is a very high mortality environment, and particularly for women, there's quite a high mortality at the end of the reproductive age, and sex ratios to become very skewed towards males at the later life. Then here I've just added on who is present or co-resident in the camp, and we see there's little variance in mothers and fathers, so children are generally co-resident with them. About 50% of children had sisters and about 60% had brothers, but only about 15 to 30% of children were co-resident with one type of grandparent. And this is because the Agta, like many other, are a mobile hunter and gatherer population. So they move around to a number of different camps, depending on the time of year, hunting, foraging and collecting, goals, social events and interpersonal relationships, or just because they wanted to. And we do tend to see, as the literature demonstrates, that maternal grandparents you're slightly more likely to be co-resident with maternal grandparents. However, they are so frequently mobile, it's quite hard to pin this down. And then finally, even if you are, your grandparents are alive and present, it doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be providing any low interactions, which is the rusty brown bar, bar there, and high interactions, which is the dark brown bar. I hypothesized, and I'm very eager to work on this further, that this may have some demographic origins. So it's quite a high mortality environment. As I said, there's quite not many older individuals in the population to begin with, but also this has consequences for generation gaps and reproductive conflict. So the age of first reproduction is quite young, at age 20, and the interbirth intervals are quite short, about 2.4 years. So this means that when daughters may have 2 to 3 children already, their mothers still have several children under the age of 11. And so this means that they have their own caring responsibilities and may be less, even if they are present in camp, they may be less willing or able to provide intense childcare. Finally, if we separate that into the grandmothers who had some children and some grandmothers who didn't have some children, those grandmothers were actually quite old, average age about 70, and they were at this point then quite frail, and only about 1/3 of them were actually fit and healthy, and so it's questionable how much care they could have offered. So I think this is just really important to compare that to the number of non-kin and distant kin that children had available to them. And so whilst grandparents might be an important resource, it doesn't mean that they are not necessarily available. And that's why we see the effect averaged across the whole population, that on average, they aren't coming up very frequently. So now I'm going to shift focus and look about who cared to looking at the dynamics of support. So not just who provided that support, but what effect it had, particularly on the maternal childcare workload. So previous literature from evolutionary anthropology perspectives has tended to look at the ultimate consequences of allomothering, in particular the fitness outcomes associated like fertility increases or child survivorship and or nutritional status. However, this assumes that support would always have a consistent effect, and as evidence from Sear and Cole's review, it doesn't. So we need to establish a better understanding about how social support impacts mothers. Under life history theory, a mother's capacity to invest in reproduction and resulting children is understood to be dependent on her resources, i.e. time and energy. And mothers allomothers by investing in a child can actually add to a mother's resources, changing her investment decisions. So this is just a visualization of that relationship here. There is a mother who is investing in a child, and the amount of investment she's giving is dependent on is demonstrated by the thickness of the arrows. But that child is also receiving a little bit, but from quite a few a little bit of investment from quite a few allomothers. And because those allomothers are giving that investment, a mother has saved some of her resources, the amount of liquid in her test tube there, and that means she has saved some energy, which she can then decide to go to spend in reproduction, somatic maintenance, or parental investment. So looking after other children or reinvesting that back into that child. So from a life history perspective, individuals have competing demands of survival, growth, and reproduction. And they're competing because we have finite amounts of energy to invest in them. So individuals are expected to invest in one of these activities depending on the fitness payoffs, which are dependent on the environment or the context that you're in. So therefore, this research project in particular wants to explore how different carers are associated to changes to maternal investment in the focal child, because that starts to really look at if that care is supportive in the way we think it is. So is it reducing her workload, freeing up that energy, rather than just making that assumption, because we don't necessarily know if her fertility would be increased or perhaps child survivorship might be increased. So who do we expect to be important? Well, the evidence about who cares demonstrates that grandparents may not be particularly important because they're not frequently around, and fathers also aren't providing a vast amount of direct childcare, but of course they are doing a lot of the resource provision, and it's just because we're looking at childcare here. However, a high percentage of the childcare did come from distant kin, non-kin and siblings, particularly sisters. And given our knowledge about the population and hunter and gatherer childhoods more broadly, we expected this to mean that maybe informal playgroups might be really important. So these are groups which freely roam around camp, made of siblings, distant kin and non-kin, and are actually, I would think, an important form of childcare and could potentially then reduce the maternal workload. And playgroups have long been studied in hunter and gatherer populations because they are ubiquitous throughout the ethnographic literature. And their function is often assumed to be related to longer term skill development for children. And certainly children do gain a lot from play and social development, but it doesn't exclude the fact that they are also providing childcare to the younger children in the playgroup, allowing the mother to go off and do other activities. And this hasn't really been studied before, and perhaps because Western perspectives of childcare from children, particularly in informal settings like this, has often been conceptualized as harmful because it interferes with children's play. So we generally expected that the playgroup would be an important form of childcare for children aged 2 to 5 years, and that would reduce the mother's childcare workload. This research paper aimed to move beyond the focus of kin as allo mothers in particular and explore the allo-maternal care from the entirety of a social network. And our question was, does direct caregiving by a range of allo mothers reduce maternal childcare in the Agta? And we asked this question on the most least aggregated data of 200,000 observations from the 78 children. And for each observational point, we asked, was a mother's absence depending on or presence dependent on who provided childcare? If the mother was absent, then we were arguing, then we think the care is substitutive because she's able to go off and do other activities. If the mother is present, then the childcare was not substitutive. So this figure is one of the main findings of the study. This is a forest plot, so these are odds ratios, but it's been a log transform, so the 0 line is no effect. If the point estimates are above the line, that means the care isn't substitutive, and actually it's more likely for the mother to be present when that person is providing childcare. And if the point estimate is below the line, that means the mother is less likely to be present, and we can understand the care to be substitutive. On this graph, we have toddlers in triangles and infants in circles. And we have all the different kin types at the bottom, but this time mothers are obviously removed. There's 3 main findings I'd like to draw your attention to. Firstly, we have fathers here, sorry, went ahead one. We have fathers here, and actually we can see in toddlers for the triangle, fathers actually made it more likely for mothers to be present. And then we have these 2 effects for maternal grandmothers and paternal grandmothers. We can see in toddlers, maternal grandmother makes it more likely for the mother to be absent, so it's substitutive, and in paternal grandmothers, the effect is in infants. And I wouldn't really make too much of a maternal-paternal difference here because the sample is very small, as I've demonstrated that there's not many individuals alive and present in the population. And I think this is just a product of the sample. And this is also the reason why the confidence intervals are quite large. So we're not completely sure about the size of the effect here, but we're quite confident it isn't spanning 0. And the thing this is really interesting is it demonstrates that even though grandmothers aren't regularly available, if they are available and able to help, then they are providing a type of care which substitutes the mother. And further investigation into our results showed that grandmothers are much more likely to be carrying, holding, feeding, or doing these kind of more complex tasks of childcare, which suggest why that's happening. Second of all, we ran an interaction with playgroup. And this demonstrated really interesting and consistent effects. While brothers, distant kin, extended kin, and non-kin and sisters all were non-significant predictors while they were outside of a playgroup, within a playgroup, they were significantly likely to predict a mother being absent. So we can see that effect there. They're all below the line. And this is comparable, making a effect size of about 80% less likely for mothers to be present when a playgroup is happening. Therefore, playgroups as well as grandmothers are substituting the mother's childcare. So these results highlight that due to demographic trends, including early mortality and early fertility, grandmothers aren't necessarily readily available for children. However, when they are available and able to help, they are associated with reduced maternal investment in a child. The same can be said for playgroups, siblings, and non-kin, and our results indicate that children can be competent caregivers without conflicting with play, challenging that Western norm that we need to protect children from caregiving responsibilities in this setting. Furthermore, it underlines the fact that childcare is often coming from beyond the nuclear family and in informal settings, which is something we need to keep on studying. And by looking at not only who provided the childcare, but what were the consequences of this childcare on maternal workload, I think we begin to understand what types of childcare are actually supportive for mothers in the way we expect. Shifting gears again, and now I want to look at the UK-based study on infant feeding to try and get a more nuanced understanding of social support. So this is a project I've been working on for a couple of years with my colleagues Sarah Myers and Emily Emmett. Similar to the work with the Agta above, we were really interested in understanding the complexities of support and the different ways it can impact mothers. As I mentioned above, support is not always going to help the mothers in the way we think, and it might vary depending on the supporter type, as it was in the case in the Agta, or it might vary based on the type of supportive act. In the case of breastfeeding information, practical and emotional support, they've all been uniformly seen to benefit the mother's physical and mental health. But these are pretty big umbrellas, and I think we need more nuance to be reflective of reality. So earlier I spoke about practical support in the form of childcare substituting the mother, and this being helpful because it reduced her workload. However, this substitutive effect in the context of infant feeding may be in an opposite direction as intended from a public health perspective when they want to increase breastfeeding duration. In particular, different types of practical support will have predictable effects on infant feeding depending on if it substitutes a mother or subsidizes her. So it can substitute a mother investment in a given activity by releasing her from a proportion of her daily tasks. She's then able to use the saved energy elsewhere, and allomothering as a substitute for breastfeeding, allofeeding as a substitute of breastfeeding would be a good example of this. So allofeeding is just when someone else is feeding the child, as pictured here, dad feeding with a bottled formula milk and to a lesser degree express milk. On the other hand, other forms of practical support, such as help with domestic chores, can subsidize the mother's time and energy budgets. And this affords mothers the option to channel additional resources into the infant, which may lead to longer breastfeeding duration. So therefore, we predicted that the receipt of practical support that substituted a mother's role in infant feeding would be negatively predicted with breastfeeding duration, while practical support that increased a mother's time and energy in other ways would be positively predicted with breastfeeding duration. We're also really interested in mothers' subjective experience of breastfeeding, and this is because infant feeding shouldn't all be about the outcomes of breastfeeding duration, but about a mother's mental and well-being during this quite stressful time period. So we also predicted that practical support would positively predict positive maternal experience of infant feeding unless it actually hindered her own infant feeding desires. So this is when if the mother intended to breastfeed and someone was feeding her infant, and that was the only support she was going to get, then that might be causing quite a lot of conflict. So we tested these predictions with a cross-sectional online survey of about 700 eligible mothers who all had infants aged 24 months and under, and this was collected via convenience sampling. This was done in December 2017 and to February 2018. And we asked a question on whether you wanted to breastfeed or not, how long you breastfed for, and this was any breastfeeding or exclusive breastfeeding. And we asked about how they experienced infant feeding in terms of, was it enjoyable, was it rewarding, or was it emotionally draining or stressful? And we also about the common problems that women experience during breastfeeding, things like having issues of latch, too much breast milk or too little, having sore or painful nipples. And finally, we asked about a whole range of support women got from potential supporters that included all their family, friends, and healthcare professionals. And we looked at informational support, emotional support, and practical support. And we also, for each of these types of support, asks, did you receive that support? And then was that support helpful, or did you find it supportive? To separate out the fact that sometimes you can have support which isn't necessarily what you wanted. So to summarize some of our data, the levels of breastfeeding are pretty high in our sample and is higher than would be expected on average in the UK. About 93% initiation rate compared to about 75% in the general population. And then a 68% of our women were breastfeeding at 6 months compared to about 34% in the wider population. And this is really because we don't have a representational sample. A disproportionate rate of the women in our sample were university educated. They were overwhelmingly white and had a higher than average household income. And this is a consistent problem with these online convenience sampling, which we hope to address in future studies, as we're well aware of the problem. What is interesting, though, is despite these quite relatively high rates of prolonged breastfeeding, it's noteworthy that they didn't guarantee a positive subjective experience relating to infant feeding. Of women who are currently breastfeeding, 38% reported an overall experience of infant feeding being stressful, while 42% found it emotionally draining, emphasizing the widespread need that women have for support. In particular, women who had intended to breastfeed but then stopped earlier than they wanted to were most likely to report their infant feeding to be stressful and emotionally draining. So we then used Cox regressions to explore the hazard of stopping exclusive breastfeeding before 6 months and the hazard of stopping any breastfeeding before less than 20 months. And our takeaway message from this paper is that social support should not be treated like a univariate entity broadly construed as beneficial. And one of these findings is associated directly to allo feeding. So on the x-axis here, there's each of the caregivers are mentioned there, and they're repeated because of non-proportional hazards. We've just split the sample up, so they're slightly different time points. But the main point is that if the point estimate is above the line, that means you are much more likely to stop breastfeeding if you receive that type of support as compared to below the line. And we can see that all those point estimates are above the line from all those different types of supporters. And a couple of the confidence intervals span the line. That's mainly because they're quite small samples for a couple of those conditions over those time periods. So what that demonstrates is that allo feeding, so the feeding the infant with a bottle, was associated with an increased hazard of stopping for exclusive and any breastfeeding really consistently in our sample. Allo feeding, as predicted, especially if the allo feeding was from the participant's own mother, was associated with the increased odds of finding infant feeding stressful and emotionally draining if you were breastfeeding, but not if you weren't breastfeeding. So this is the result here in pink, that this is the breastfeeding mother, and compared to the not breastfeeding mother in yellow. And so they found it much more stressful when their mothers were trying to help them with infant feeding. And the pattern is quite similar for partners, but here it's not dependent on feeding mode. And finally, allo feeding was broadly most compatible with reduced odds of finding infant feeding to be enjoyable and rewarding. So we can see here these blue dots here, regardless of feeding mode, if your own mother or partner, or and then slightly with less confidence, the partner's mother, generally associated with decreased likelihood of finding infant feeding to be enjoyable and rewarding. But we do have a big issue, of course, here of causality. All these findings are correlational, and we really have no idea what precedes what, because we just asked women what help did they receive early on, and then what were their experiences, and what was the help that they received. So allo feeding, at least with formula, may encourage breastfeeding cessation because, of course, it allows mothers to avoid the cost and energy costs of breastfeeding. However, the cessation of breastfeeding obviously also encourages others to help with infant feeding. So we need really good prospective data to understand the direction of causality, and this would be likely to vary depending on the individual. And we're about to, really excitingly, to start addressing this, having just been given a grant to develop a mobile app to collect daily infant feeding data. And also, we really hope this app is going to be much better at getting data from a broad range of women and a much larger sample size, which is other key problems. Finally, we also looked at breastfeeding duration and support based on maternal experience, particularly breastfeeding problems, hypothesizing that a maternal experience of problems, in particular being in need of support, might influence the outcome that support has on duration. So overwhelming message of this paper was that breastfeeding is hard. So this is a plot of all the different problems that women experience in our survey. And 93% of women suffered at least one problem, while 50% of women experienced 2 to 3 problems. The most common, as demonstrated here, was having sore or painful nipples, followed by having blocked ducts or mastitis, and then having issues with the baby latching onto the nipple, so having an efficient position for breastfeeding. And then finally, not too much breast milk, and then not enough breast milk. Following the literature, breastfeeding problems are a strong predictor of duration. However, the effects aren't actually that consistent, which I'll go on to explain in a second. So these are survivorship curves of breastfeeding duration by problem type. And here we see that the problems tended to predict, we see that the problems made it more likely for you to stop breastfeeding, which is what we'd predict. So the solid green line represents when the problem wasn't experienced, or the dashed orange line represent when the problem was experienced. So these are survivorship probabilities. So we can see that as time goes on, if you have a problem, you're much less likely to carry on breastfeeding. So this demonstrates for issues such as not enough breast milk and latch issues, which are often related to infants' nutritional intake or maternal perceptions of it. If you have this issue, you're much more likely to stop breastfeeding before 3 months. And we just cap the analysis there because most women experience those problems in those first 13 weeks. However, other issues such as too much breast milk, blocked ducts and sore nipples were associated with longer breastfeeding duration. So here we can see the green line is at the bottom, which is when you don't have that problem. And these issues are more related to maternal pain, discomfort, and something for mothers to manage. And actually what's really interesting is the differences in maternal experiences of breastfeeding problems and the effect it has on duration did seem to be moderated by social support. So we ran interaction models to look about how the effect of breastfeeding problems on breastfeeding duration were moderated by support. There were a lot of models, and this is a side effect of having to look at all the complex different ways that support is working. And so here I'm just highlighting the overwhelming trend, and please do go look at the preprint if you're interested in further information. And this figure has results of the significant models, and the orange results are when support is for the blocked ducts, latch, sore, or too much milk, whilst the yellow bars are support in the context of not enough milk. And we can see there's big differences because in this plot, if the line is above the center, it means that you have an increased hazard of stopping breastfeeding. But if the line is below if the column is below the line, then you have a decreased risk of stopping. And what we can see here is that primary issues primarily associated with maternal discomfort and pain, such as blocked ducts, sore nipples, and too much milk. These are, when you receive support, that actually means you're less likely to stop breastfeeding compared to if you don't receive the support, then you are more likely to stop breastfeeding when you have those problems. However, issues associated with not enough milk, where mothers are concerned about infants receiving sufficient nutrition, here support was negatively correlated with duration, so it increased the likelihood of stopping. Arguably, this is because women have to make their own evaluations about the cost and benefits of breastfeeding. And if they believe they're not adequately providing the resources their infant needs, they may stop stop breastfeeding. However, in an environment which, especially in the UK context, in terms of policy and promotion, good mothering is really associated with breastfeeding. It's quite stressful, and women have a lot of guilt for stopping to breastfeed. So that and the support they might be getting is actually probably reconciling that the stigma associated to stopping breastfeeding. Rather than so they've made the decision to stop, and then they've gone to get the support. Again, another plug for the need for prospective data. But I do also think this really highlights that it's really important to not only think about breastfeeding duration, but also think about how we support mothers' mental well-being. These results also finally indicate that the women, I'm not sure if you can see very well, but the lots of support from lots of different people are important here: partners, sisters, friends, paternal, grandparents. GP in the UK is your family doctor, health visitor is a community nurse, and your midwife, all important and offering support across different domains. So to conclude, mothers require significant support to raise children because humans have a unique life history strategy where we have lots of highly dependent children with different needs and ages. Evidence from a wide range of settings demonstrated just here from case studies from the Philippines and the UK, so from hunter and gatherers to a high income context. Women are receiving support from a wide range of individuals, and this support comes in lots of different forms. We shouldn't ignore these different types of support, and we need to broaden our perspectives out about Western norms of nuclear families and expert-led childcare. We should consider the roles of older children, informal settings, and friends and non-kin, as they all provide support. And if we don't study that, we won't be able to better understand and be able to leverage it. There is no one-size-fits-all solution to support, and the consequences of the support will be dependent on the maternal goals, her experiences, as well as the types of support which are offered and who offers it. And some types of support may not necessarily lead to positive outcomes as we define them, such as prolonged breastfeeding. And so we should ultimately be aware that women have their own goals, and support should, as much as possible, be personalized and responsive. And by better understanding the dynamics, I think we can be better able to understand women and the ways they need to be supported. So this is a point that myself and my lovely collaborators, Emily Emmett and Sarah Myers, are making in an upcoming special issue of Field Trans B called Multidisciplinary Perspectives of Social Support and Maternal and Child Health. It's coming out on the 3rd of May, lots of evolutionary contributions, so just a plug to read it. And with that, I'll just say thank you very much for you for listening. My co-authors and co-editors, the Evolutionary Demography Lab at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, my funders, and of course the Agta and all the UK mums that have participated in the study. Thanks. I'll stop sharing.
All right, so now we'll open it up for questions from the audience.
I'd love to ask a question.
Go ahead.
Anyway, lovely talk, and I was really interested to hear how you're putting all these different disciplines together. My questions are both about Agta data. Do you have an idea what proportion of the food people are eating comes from sources other than being hunted and gathered, horticulture, agriculture, even development aid? What's going on there?
Yeah, I actually had that slide in and I took it out because I was cramming in too much, of course. So it's really variable in the population. It ranges up to about 30% of food will be coming, or I should say 30% of activities are producing food, which is associated with farming or selling the food, trading the food, and buying rice. And tubers from the farming population. There's not much developmental aid, not that much market integration really. Most of it is wage labour and own cultivation. But then the more mobile camps, only about 3% of activities are there. So there's quite a big distribution. And what's really interesting is the childcare does seem to vary depending on where people are and the types of camps they're living in. Which is really interesting. Grandmothers are particularly more important in the more permanent camps compared to the more mobile camps.
I see. could you say more about what the father's contribution to subsistence are, and also what kind of direct contact between fathers and infants still nursing that you're seeing in the Agta?
Yeah, the fathers are producing the majority of the calories. Most of the calories are coming from fishing. And so this is particularly the case in the populations that are living in the coast, is that they that is a very intensive activity where they spend a couple of hours off the edge of the reef diving to catch bigger fish. So the childcare data definitely underestimates the amount of the father's involvement in that sense, because they are primarily providing the food, and they aren't that frequently as a result around camp. And if they are around camp, they are normally just proximate within the hut, but they're not necessarily providing quite intensive childcare. It isn't a situation like perhaps we see in the Central African pygmy populations, where the fathers are actually doing a lot more. It's actually quite, it was much more women and children around the camp and fathers out elsewhere.
It's my impression, I don't have data on this from other people's work, but it's my impression that fathers are rarely directly offering food to infants, even in the societies where they're, providing quite a lot of it. What does it look like in the Agta?
I don't know.
Maybe it's because they're not doing much of it and you haven't seen it. No.
Yeah, I aggregated all the data to look at it, where I put all the high investment together. So I'd have to have a look and to see how much they are actually feeding. Yeah, I'm not sure, but I have the data.
Thank you.
Awesome. Any other questions? Actually, Melanie, you have a question? Go for it.
Thanks. Hi, Abby. Thank you for a great talk. Very fascinating work. I have a question about the UK study. And sorry if I missed this. Did part of the allo feeding, would that include pumped milk for some of the mothers as well? And then maybe this is something that's also being addressed in a follow-up study, but how does maternal work demands feed into who they're, why they need allo care in the first place, and how that can be part of the stress in navigating, their feeding needs.
So if I understand you correctly, if they have to go back out to employment, how does that impact support that they need, and how that impacts?
Right, so if part of the need for feeding and allo care is because they're working, and so a lot of the stress related to to continuing breastfeeding and maybe issues about feeding are also related to their kind of having to work and balance childcare.
Yeah, no, we haven't looked into that with the sample. I mean, we certainly ask questions in terms of that. I think within the UK context, because these are quite affluent mothers, and we have our paid maternity leave is like 3 months off the top of my head, and then after that you can take another 9 months at statutory pay, which is about £700 a month. So it's above minimum wage. So as a result, there isn't such an economic pressure to get back to work in the same way as I think there may be in other settings. And again, because of the women are quite affluent, I don't think there's lots of variation in that data to explore that. And I think that's one of my frustrations with our data set, is that the women are quite similar, and it's quite hard to get enough variance to look at. I think need is one of the most important aspects of social support, and that's when we're going to see these biggest effects. And quite a lot of, we don't have that variation in need in the sample, and I hope that our next set of data collection will go ahead and be able to explore that in a lot more detail. And yes, just to answer the other bit of your question, it included both formula and express. It was just, did you bottle feed? And we didn't specify.
I would just be curious too, if in that case, because pumping is stressful in and of itself. So are they also referring to the stress of maintaining supply through pumping as as one of the sources of stress.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, again, definitely the need for much more nuanced data on that, because what happens before what I think is really important, because we've just got at the kind of end picture and people are summarizing a lot of experiences into one of a couple of words, and it's not really good enough.
Great, thank you. Look forward to seeing the rest of the study, future study.
Awesome, that was great. That was a preview from a speaker who's going to be presenting to this group in a few weeks, Dr. Martin. Ben, you're up next.
Yeah, hey, that'd be a great talk. So I had a quick question. Did any of the women in this study still hunt? Because I know that Agta women are kind of famous for engaging in a fairly high rate of hunting compared to other populations. And I was wondering, you think that when more women were hunting, there would be higher rates of allocare? Because obviously carrying around a child would be pretty difficult for most hunting.
Yeah, there's no women hunting in the population of the Agta that we work with. So what's interesting about the Agta and the sample, the population where that literature is from, is that they are much more mountainous. And whilst it's geographically quite close, because of the typology of the land, actually they're following really different strategies. And so there's very little hunting in our population in general, and women weren't really involved in that much. But because they're quite a lot of the population is coastal, they are doing a lot of gathering of when the tide goes out, they're going gathering all the sea life, octopus and crustaceans and things like that. But that's very compatible with childcare, because they all kind of come along and they kind of set up on the beach. The household kind of sets up on the beach for the day and goes, and the husband may go and do some deeper sea diving, and the children and the mother will do some collecting. So it doesn't seem to be so incompatible in this context. And yes, I think it's just the difference between hunting and not. And I don't know if the population in the mountain are still, because I know that's one of the few cases that I know of also. So it would be interesting for further study to be done there.
Thanks so much.
Awesome. Sylvie.
Hi, thanks for that talk. I had a question about your UK data, and I was wondering if you have any data on the siblings, because just, personal experiences, breastfeeding with just one baby is a lot easier than having also a toddler around. So is there any data that you have on siblings, and particularly the care that then, or the help that they have for caring for siblings?
Yeah, we did ask how many children people had. We haven't broken it down into looking at that. Whilst I think our models did control for, actually no, they did control for the household size. Yeah, no, that would be interesting, because your time demands are much more, your time demands are much more, you're pulled in lots of different directions much more, which is again a greater need for care. And I do think, however, our sample would struggle to answer that question in more depth, though, because a lot of the mothers were first-time mums. And I think that really is a problem we keep coming up, is I think breastfeeding is quite an emotive topic in the UK, and women who breastfeed feel they will be really eager to fill these online surveys, because they do take a little bit of while, and they feel like they're championing the. I do this. There's nothing wrong in doing this, but it just means that sample you're going to get are going to be the women who have the time and the passion to do it, and that's why we're trying to think of new methodologies to collect this data, because I think because a lot of mums were first-time mums who spend a lot of time breastfeeding with their mobile in hand, basically.